You hear them before you see them. The laugh arrives first. Big, unguarded, filling the room from wall to wall before their face even comes into focus. The kind of laugh that makes other people smile reflexively, involuntarily, the way a yawn travels. The kind that makes you think, that person is fine. That person is doing well. That person has figured something out about how to move through this world with joy. You watch them work the room. The quick joke at exactly the right moment. The self-deprecating story that makes everyone lean in. The ability to find the absurdity in any situation, to locate the funny thing in the unfunny thing, to hold the whole room in the warmth of their humor before anyone has had a second drink. You think, I want to be around that energy. I want some of what they have. And then, much later, in a different context, a quiet car ride, a long night, a moment where the performance drops because the energy to maintain it simply ran out, you see something else. A stillness underneath the noise. A particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with the hour. An expression that crosses their face when they think no one is looking, so brief and so complete that you almost wonder if you imagined it. You didn't imagine it. What you saw was the thing the laugh was built to cover. Not covering it dishonestly, not performing happiness they don't feel. Something more complicated than that. Something that took years to construct and functions, most of the time, with extraordinary efficiency. The laugh is not a lie. The warmth is not manufactured. The humor is genuinely theirs, but underneath it, quieter, older, more carefully managed than anyone outside their own skull will ever fully know, is something that needed the laugh in order to survive. This is not a sad story. It is not a story about people who are broken. It is a story about people who built something remarkable from conditions that required it. Who turned their pain into the most generous thing they had to offer the people around them. Who learned, before they had the language for what they were learning, that humor is not the opposite of suffering. It is, in many cases, suffering's most sophisticated and most misunderstood response. And here is the question that most people who love these people have never thought to ask. What does it cost them to keep the room laughing? This didn't start as a personality trait. Long before it became the thing everyone loves about them, the energy they bring into a room, the reliability of their humor, the way they can find something funny in almost anything, it started as something much more urgent. Something the nervous system built, not for other people's entertainment, but for its own survival. This wiring began in the specific conditions of a childhood that required something of them that most childhoods don't. Maybe the house you grew up in was heavy in a way that nobody talked about. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside, just heavy. A parent whose pain was always present, just beneath the surface, requiring management. A household where the emotional atmosphere could shift without warning, and where the fastest way to redirect that shift, to lighten it, to create a moment of connection that interrupted the tension, was to make someone laugh. You learned, before you had words for what you were learning, that humor was power. Not the power to change what was happening, the power to briefly change how it felt. Or maybe it was loneliness that built it. The particular loneliness of a child who didn't quite fit, who felt the gap between their interior world and the world everyone else seemed to be inhabiting, and discovered that the fastest bridge across that gap was a well-timed joke. That humor was the universal currency, the reliable entry point, the thing that made you belong before you had figured out how to be known. Researchers at Harvard Medical School studying the development of coping mechanisms in childhood found consistent evidence that children who grow up in emotionally unpredictable or high-stress environments develop what psychologists call approach-oriented coping, active strategies for managing distress that transform it into something more tolerable. For children with a natural facility for language and social reading, humor becomes one of the most effective of these strategies. It transforms pain into connection. It converts private suffering into shared laughter. And it works, which is precisely why it becomes the mechanism of choice and why it becomes, over years of practice, indistinguishable from personality. This wiring began when you were small enough that using it felt like the only available option. Long before anyone called you funny, you were using humor the way other children used silence or withdrawal or compliance, as a way of managing an environment that asked too much of you. The difference was that your strategy had an audience, and the audience responded. And the response felt like love, or something close enough to love that a child who needed it couldn't tell the difference. By the time you were old enough to understand what you'd built, you'd been building it for years. And it had become yours, genuinely, completely yours, even if the conditions that required it were never yours to choose. Laughter is not simply a response to something funny. Neuroscientists studying the physiology of humor have documented something more complex and more interesting than that. Laughter activates the brain's reward circuitry, the same dopaminergic pathways involved in pleasure, social bonding, and the relief of physical pain. It triggers the release of endorphins, the body's endogenous opioids, creating a genuine analgesic effect. It downregulates the stress response, reducing cortisol and adrenaline. It signals to the nervous system, with remarkable efficiency, that the immediate environment is safe. Psychologist Rod Martin, whose decades of research on the psychology of humor produced the foundational Humor Styles Questionnaire used by researchers worldwide, documented 4 distinct humor styles with profoundly different psychological profiles. 2 of them, affiliative humor and self-enhancing humor, are associated with resilience, emotional regulation, and psychological well-being. The other 2, aggressive humor and self-defeating humor, are associated with anxiety, depression, and the use of laughter specifically to deflect discomfort. The person this script is about often uses all 4, and the distinction between them, which the person in question can rarely articulate, but which their nervous system navigates with extraordinary precision, is the difference between humor as genuine joy and humor as armor. The armor version is not dishonest. This cannot be said clearly enough. The person who uses humor to manage pain is not performing a false emotion. They are doing something more sophisticated. They are taking a real emotion, the absurdity of difficulty, the genuine comedy embedded in suffering, and amplifying it, foregrounding it, making it the face that the world sees. The pain doesn't disappear, it recedes. And what stands in front of it is something real, something theirs, something that genuinely connects them to other people. Attachment theory adds another layer. People who grew up in environments where emotional directness was unavailable or unsafe learn to approach connection obliquely. The child who couldn't say, "I'm scared," learned to make a joke about the scary thing. The person who couldn't say, "I'm hurting," learned to find the funny angle on the hurt. This is not suppression in the clinical sense. It is redirection. The emotion is acknowledged, briefly, at an angle, in a way that allows it to exist without requiring anyone to respond to it directly. Psychologist James Gross at Stanford University, whose research on emotion regulation transformed how the field understands how people manage their emotional lives, identified humor as one of the most cognitively sophisticated regulation strategies available, requiring simultaneous awareness of the painful reality and the capacity to reframe it. People who use it fluently have developed, whether they know it or not, an extraordinary piece of psychological machinery. The laugh is not a mask, it is a translation. And the question is whether anyone around them has ever learned to read what it's translating. Most people look at the person who laughs loudest in the room and see someone who is doing well. They see the social ease and read it as contentment. They see the humor and interpret it as lightness. They see the person who can find something funny in any situation and conclude, reasonably, almost inevitably, that this is someone who has made their peace with the world, who doesn't carry much, who processes difficulty quickly and moves through it with enviable grace. But psychology tells a completely different story. What looks like lightness is often weight that has been expertly reframed. What reads as social ease is frequently the highly practiced performance of someone who learned, very early, that their value in any room was proportional to how much they could elevate its energy. What the world calls charisma in this specific population is, at its root, a coping mechanism so thoroughly integrated into personality that neither the person using it nor the people benefiting from it can fully see it for what it is. From the outside, it looks like they don't feel things as heavily as other people. From the inside, it often feels like feeling things more heavily than most, and having built the most efficient available system for making that fact invisible. The myth that funny people are fundamentally happy people, that humor and pain are incompatible, that someone who makes you laugh could not simultaneously be struggling in ways they haven't told you about, this myth is not malicious. It is simply wrong. And it does genuine damage in a specific and consistent way. It makes the pain of people who use humor to manage it completely invisible to the people who love them most. Psychologist James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, whose landmark research on emotional disclosure documented the health consequences of unexpressed emotional experience, found that the people most likely to suppress emotional disclosure were also the people most likely to develop what he called an expressive gap, a growing distance between interior experience and exterior presentation. For people who use humor as their primary coping language, this gap can become enormous. Not because they are dishonest, but because the mechanism works so well that it leaves no visible evidence of the original pain. Society calls them the life of the party. Their nervous system calls them exhausted. Society calls them resilient. Their interior experience sometimes calls it lonely. The specific loneliness of being the person who makes everyone feel better without anyone noticing that they need someone to do the same for them. What the world reads as a personality type is, in almost every case, a survival strategy that became a personality. And the difference matters, not to diminish the humor, not to reframe the laugh as something less than what it is, but to make visible the person underneath it who has, in most cases, been patiently waiting for someone to look. Here is what it costs to be the funny one. The first cost is the loneliness of being misread so completely and so consistently. When your primary language for pain is humor, the people around you rarely know when you're struggling. Not because they don't care, because you are too skilled at what you do. The distress signal is encoded in a frequency they cannot hear because you built the transmission system specifically to make it inaudible. And so you exist in a particular kind of solitude, surrounded by people who love you, genuinely loved by them, and yet fundamentally unseen in the ways that would allow you to be helped. The second cost is what happens to the interior experience over time. Humor is a redirection mechanism, not a resolution mechanism. The thing that was painful does not disappear when you make a joke about it. It recedes. And in receding, it becomes harder to access directly. harder to bring to the surface in the language that could actually be heard and responded to. Over years of this practice, many people who use humor as their primary coping tool find that they have become genuinely uncertain about what they feel beneath the humor. The translation happens so fast, so automatically, so early in the emotional processing sequence that they sometimes cannot locate the original feeling anymore. There is a specific kind of emotional loneliness in knowing that the part of you that most needs to be seen is the part that your greatest strength was built to conceal. The third cost is the weight of other people's expectations. Once you have established yourself as the person who makes things lighter, who lifts the energy, who can be counted on to find the funny in the unfunny, you have also established a role that is very difficult to step out of. The days when you are genuinely depleted, when the weight is too present to be redirected, when you walk into a room and have nothing left, those days carry their own burden. Not just the original pain, the additional weight of being seen not to be the person everyone expected. The fourth cost is the grief that doesn't get spoken. Because humor moves pain into shared space, it is also a way of making pain communal without ever having to name it. The joke about the hard thing is both an acknowledgement and a deflection. The people who laugh with you felt the hard thing briefly and then let it go. You felt it too, but carried it longer. The laugh dispersed their portion. Yours remained. You are not broken. The mechanism you built, the ability to hold pain and humor simultaneously, to find the absurd thread in the difficult thing, to transform private suffering into something that connects you to other people. This is one of the most sophisticated psychological achievements a human being can make. Do not let anyone, including yourself, reduce it to simply being good at jokes. What you built required, first, the capacity to feel things fully. You cannot find the funny in the unfunny without genuinely knowing what the unfunny costs. The humor that comes from real pain has a quality that audiences can feel without being able to name. A specific gravity, a resonance, a permission to acknowledge difficulty that safe humor cannot replicate. This is why the funniest people so often make you feel, in the middle of laughter, that you have also been seen in something real. Your nervous system did what it had to do. In conditions that required a way to manage what was unmanageable, it found the most generous available option. It did not turn inward with the pain. It turned it outward, into warmth, into connection, into something that made the people around you feel less alone in their own difficulty. The fact that this mechanism also served you is not a contradiction. The fact that it concealed your own pain in the process is not a flaw. It is the inevitable consequence of a strategy built under conditions that did not offer you the luxury of showing what you were actually carrying. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and built from that experience a theory of meaning-making under suffering, documented something that speaks directly to this: the human capacity to transform suffering through expression, through art, through humor, through the act of making something from pain that others can receive, is not a denial of that suffering. It is its most complete form of integration. The laugh does not erase what you feel, it transmutes it. And transmutation is not the same as hiding. You are not the laugh instead of the pain, you are both, simultaneously, which is harder and more honest than most people manage. What this moment asks of you is not to stop being funny. The humor is real. It serves you and the people you love and the rooms you walk into, and there is nothing wrong with any of it. What this moment asks is simply this: to allow someone, yourself if no one else is available, to know what the laugh is carrying. To let the translation go both directions. To be seen not just as the person who makes things lighter, but as the person who has been carrying the weight that made the lightening necessary. That person deserves to be known, and they have been patient long enough. There is a specific kind of courage that belongs to people who carry pain lightly. Not the courage of endurance, though that is real and present, the more specific courage of transformation, of taking something that could have closed you off and using it instead to open toward others, of deciding at some level that precedes conscious decision that your pain would become generosity rather than withdrawal. Most people who suffer become quieter. They pull back. The difficulty goes inward, and they protect themselves from further loss by offering less. This is understandable. This is, in many contexts, wise. But there is a different kind of response, rarer, stranger, more complicated to carry, where the pain goes outward instead, where the difficult thing becomes the source of the funniest story, where the grief becomes the warmest humor, where the person who has the most reason to protect themselves is somehow also the person in the room who gives the most away. This is not sainthood. It is not the absence of self-protection. It is a different form of it, one that found a way to be both protected and generous simultaneously, which is a psychological achievement so quiet and so complete that most of the people who love these people will go their entire lives without fully understanding what they are in the presence of. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote that the absurd is born of the confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. He also wrote, in a different register, perhaps more personally, that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not naively, not in denial of the boulder, but in possession of something the boulder cannot take, the freedom of the interior response to it. The people who laugh loudest know something about this, not because they have escaped their difficulty, because they found, somewhere in the space between the weight of it and the people standing in front of them, a way to make the weight, briefly, irrelevant, to convert it, however temporarily, into light. That is not nothing. That is, in the fullest sense available, everything. And the next time you are in a room with someone whose laugh arrives before they do, whose humor fills the space before anyone has asked anything of them, consider that what you are witnessing is not simply personality. It is practice. It is history. It is a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has found the most generous possible use for it. You do not need to fix anything. You do not need to say anything. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can offer is simply to stay in the room after the laugh has faded and let them know, without requiring them to ask, that you see what's underneath it.
Gotta get this to the right. Argh, just a little further. Ugh, almost there. Whew.